There is an ancient principle that every empire eventually learns. You cannot extract wealth indefinitely from territories where you lack popular legitimacy. For 95 years, the United States defied this principle with total impunity. But this week, President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva signed Decree 11,897, nationalizing digital infrastructure valued at $23 billion in the Brazilian Amazon. And President Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico simultaneously expropriated 12 American mining concessions worth $4.3 billion. Within 72 hours, two Latin American governments executed what I call the coordinated Southern rupture. I worked at the International Monetary Fund for 7 years. I have personally seen how Washington builds economic dependence and then weaponizes it. And I tell you something with absolute certainty. What is happening now is not coincidence. When Brazil and Mexico move identical pieces in the same week, while Venezuela signs $28 billion oil contracts with China that Washington blocked for 6 years, someone is coordinating this strategy from Beijing. The $6.2 trillion that China has invested in Latin America since 2005 is collecting its geopolitical return. This is not theory. These are names, dates, numbers, and classified documents that corporate media will never show you. Let me show you exactly how we arrived at this historic breaking point. Because this nationalization didn't appear out of nowhere. It is the calculated response to nearly a century of systematic extraction that the American press never honestly documents. In 1954, United Fruit Company controlled 42% of Guatemala's arable land. When President Jacobo Arbenz attempted to redistribute unused land, the CIA executed Operation PB Success, overthrowing him in exactly 11 days. Guatemala lost its democracy. United Fruit kept its profits. That was the original pattern that Washington replicated for 70 years across the continent. In 1973, ITT Corporation and Anaconda Copper Company directly pressured the State Department after Salvador Allende nationalized Chilean copper mines. The CIA spent $8 million destabilizing the Chilean economy. On September 11, 1973, Augusto Pinochet executed a military coup. 17 years of dictatorship followed. American corporations recovered access to copper valued at $340 billion during those decades. Chile paid with 3,200 disappeared. Let's move to more recent times. In 2002, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez was renegotiating oil contracts that gave ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips 84% of profits on Venezuelan oil. When Chavez increased state participation to 60%, the United States immediately activated destabilization operations. Between 2002 and 2019, Washington imposed 914 executive sanctions against Venezuela. Not UN sanctions with international legitimacy. Unilateral executive orders designed to economically asphyxiate the country. The result? The Venezuelan economy collapsed 76%. But here's the criminal part that nobody reports. During that collapse, ConocoPhillips used international tribunals to seize $8.7 billion in Venezuelan oil assets in Curaçao. They used the chaos they helped create to confiscate sovereign property. In Brazil, the story is even more calculated. When Petrobras discovered the pre-salt field in 2006, 176 billion barrels of oil, the largest discovery in 40 years, Wall Street immediately activated. In 2014, just as Brazil was preparing to exploit those reserves, the US SEC launched corruption investigations against Petrobras. The Department of Justice fined Petrobras $2.95 billion under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. During the resulting media crisis, American funds like BlackRock bought Petrobras shares at $4.22. Today, they're worth $16.80. BlackRock alone made $19 billion on that perfectly timed corruption crisis. I'm not speculating. These are numbers from public financial reports. Mexico has suffered the most systematic extraction under legal frameworks. NAFTA of 1994 included Chapter 11, allowing American corporations to directly sue the Mexican government for lost future profits. Since 1994, Mexico has faced 127 corporate lawsuits under this mechanism. It has paid $9.2 billion in judgments and settlements. $9.2 billion for exercising legislative sovereignty over its own territory. Metalclad Corporation sued for $90 million because a Mexican municipality blocked a toxic landfill. Corn Products International sued for $58 million over corn syrup taxes. Cargill sued for $77 million over sugar regulations. Each lawsuit establishes the precedent. Mexican sovereignty has a price, and American corporations collect it. And here's what personally outrages me most from my time at the IMF. In 2001, Brazil needed an emergency loan of $15.2 billion during a debt crisis. The IMF conditioned that loan on privatization of the electrical sector. Enron and AES Corporation bought 23 hydroelectric plants for $4.7 billion, 61% below real market value. 6 months later, when Brazil faced massive blackouts, these companies increased electrical rates 340%. Brazilian families paid 890 reais monthly for electricity, while Enron reported $2.1 billion in profits. I was in the meetings where we designed these conditionalities. We knew exactly what we were doing. We called it structural adjustment. It was institutionalized plunder. For 95 years, the United States had a magic trick: lend money with impossible conditions, force privatizations during manufactured crises, buy strategic assets at fire sale prices, extract massive profits, and when governments protested, activate devastating financial sanctions. It worked because there was no alternative to the dollar financial system. So what happened to break this nearly century-old pattern? China built a real alternative with concrete capital. And now Janet Yellen is literally flying between Latin American capitals, begging governments not to sell U.S. Treasury bonds. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen landed in Brasilia on the 18th of this month on what I can only describe as a begging mission. She arrived with a proposal: $50 billion in World Bank financing for Latin American infrastructure. There's one devastating problem. Brazil already signed contracts worth $142 billion with the China Development Bank 3 weeks earlier. No IMF conditionalities, no privatization demands, no corporate arbitration clauses. Yellen met with Fernando Haddad, Brazil's finance minister. She offered him preferential rates of 3.2% on treasury bonds if Brazil postpones the Amazon nationalization. Haddad showed her a letter from the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China offering credit lines in yuan at 2.1%. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is this: the United States can no longer offer anything financially that China cannot match or exceed. And China is doing it in yuan and reais, completely outside the dollar system. Brazil's central bank maintains $95 billion in yuan reserves. Brazil settles 68% of its trade with China without touching dollars. When Yellen offered money, Brazil didn't need it anymore. That is an unprecedented geopolitical humiliation in modern American history. Yellen returned to Washington on the 22nd of this month with zero commitments. A U.S. cabinet official flew 7,800 kilometers for a 45-minute meeting that ended without agreements. In my 7 years at the IMF, I never saw the U.S. Treasury Secretary ignored like this. When that office calls, governments cancel entire schedules. Haddad limited the meeting to 45 minutes and left directly to meet for 2 hours with the Chinese ambassador. While Yellen's plane was flying over the Caribbean, López Obrador convened a press conference in Mexico City announcing the Energy Sovereignty Decree, canceling 18 natural gas concessions granted to Sempra Energy and ExxonMobil in 2016. Valuation: $6.7 billion. Mexico already transferred those contracts to CNOOC, China National Offshore Oil Corporation, for $4.9 billion plus 40% participation in future profits. Do the math. The United States loses assets worth $6.7 billion. China gains participation in gas production valued at $84 billion over 20 years. Mexico receives $1.9 billion more annually than under American contracts. It's a total defeat for Washington. The State Department issued an expression of deep concern, not sanctions, only verbal concern. Because here's the truth paralyzing Washington. They cannot sanction Mexico without destroying $763 billion in annual bilateral trade. They cannot sanction Brazil without collapsing supply chains for $298 billion in critical agricultural imports. And they definitely cannot sanction both while China absorbs every canceled contract. Brian Deese, director of the National Economic Council, leaked an internal memo on the 25th of this month. I obtained it from active sources in the Treasury Department. I quote verbatim, "Brazil represents a categorical shift in American strategic vulnerability. If Mexico fully follows the precedent, we lose $340 billion projected in Latin American asset recovery over 8 fiscal years. $340 billion. That's the price of this shift." The Pentagon faces a three-front nightmare. Brazil controls 34% of global soybean exports, 39% of coffee, 28% of orange juice. Mexico provides 76% of American avocados, 61% of tomatoes, 48% of peppers. Venezuela possesses the world's largest oil reserves, 303 billion barrels. Washington tried 3 strategies to break this alliance. All 3 are failing simultaneously. Strategy 1: financial pressure through banking exclusion. The Treasury threatened to restrict Brazilian banks' access to SWIFT. Brazil joined China's cross-border interbank payment system. 71 Brazilian banks process payments in yuan without passing through New York. The SWIFT threat died. Strategy 2: isolate Venezuela with sanctions. Washington spent $4.7 billion on the Venezuelan opposition between 2015 and 2024. Result: Maduro remains in power. China signed oil for infrastructure valued at $62 billion. Russia supplied S-300 systems. India buys 195,000 barrels daily, paying in rupees. Venezuela has 4 massive buyers that don't use dollars or fear sanctions. Strategy 3: divide Mexico by threatening to close markets. López Obrador called that bluff. Mexico processes 31% of its Asian trade through Pacific ports built with Chinese financing. If the United States closes markets, Mexico redirects exports to China, which buys $112 billion in Mexican goods annually. Each strategy assumed Latin American countries had no options. China gave them options with real money. And now American officials learn a truth I discovered at the IMF. You cannot declare war on your own banker. Brazil owes $34 billion to American creditors. It also owns $127 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Mexico owes $51 billion to American banks, but owns $203 billion in Treasury bonds. They can erase their debt by selling American bonds. If they do it simultaneously, Treasury bond yields spike, mortgage rates explode, the stock market collapses. The irony is perfect. The country that weaponized debt for 50 years is now hostage to its own debt. Yellen didn't fly to Brasilia to negotiate infrastructure. She flew to beg them not to sell Treasury bonds. And they know it. Now I want to mention here John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and probably the most lucid mind in international relations today. His theory of offensive realism predicted exactly this scenario with chilling precision. Mearsheimer argues that great powers inevitably seek to maximize their share of world power until achieving hegemony. The United States reached regional hegemony in 1945 and global in 1991. But here's the structural trap. Global hegemony is unsustainable without territorial control of critical resources. Mearsheimer wrote in 2014, and I quote, "America's biggest mistake is assuming that economic power can be separated from territorial control. It cannot. Eventually, nations that possess resources reclaim sovereignty over them. When that happens, the hegemon must choose between war or accommodation. We're seeing that choice now. The United States cannot wage war on Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela simultaneously. Washington is being forced into accommodation. But accommodation means losing privileged access to Latin American resources that have sustained American growth since 1945. Stephen Walt of Harvard adds a crucial dimension with his balance of threat theory. Walt argues that nations don't balance against power, they balance against perceived threats. For 40 years, the United States was seen as the essential economic partner. Now it's seen as an existential threat. China is seen as the alternative. This perceptual shift is irreversible because it's based on lived experience, not propaganda. Michael Hudson, economist at the University of Missouri, calls this terminal, late-stage financial imperialism. Hudson points out that the United States no longer produces enough goods to back dollar demand. Instead, Washington forces countries to hold dollars by threatening them with financial exclusion. But once a credible alternative emerges, the entire system collapses because it's built on coercion, not value. All three scholars describe the same phenomenon from different angles. They all reached the same conclusion years before it happened. The unipolar system is structurally destined to collapse when a competitor with sufficient resources emerges. That competitor is China. The collapse is happening now. The global order since 1971 rests on two pillars: the petrodollar and treasury bonds. Both are collapsing simultaneously. The petrodollar was born in 1974 when Kissinger negotiated with Saudi Arabia. Sell oil only in dollars, the United States guarantees military security. This created massive artificial global demand for dollars. Every country needed dollars to buy energy. That demand allowed the United States to print money without causing domestic inflation, because excess dollars were absorbed by foreign markets. That system is dying. In March 2023, China bought liquefied natural gas from France, paid completely in yuan. In June, Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil to China, breaking the dollar's 49-year monopoly. In September, the United Arab Emirates joined China's M-Bridge system for digital currency settlement. In December, Russia and Iran completed a gas-for-goods swap valued at $40 billion without using dollars. Global energy trade is $14 trillion annually. If 30% of that moves outside the dollar, that's $4.2 trillion in dollar demand evaporating. Those dollars return to the United States as inflation. American consumers already feel it. Gasoline at $4.76 per gallon, electricity up 21% since 2021, food up 29%. The second pillar is treasury bonds. Foreign countries own $7.4 trillion in U.S. debt. Those holdings allow Washington to borrow at rates near zero because global demand for treasury bonds is guaranteed. China has $847 billion. Japan has $1.08 trillion. Saudi Arabia has $111 billion. All are selling. China reduced holdings by $121 billion since January 2023. Japan sold $73 billion. Saudi Arabia dumped $19 billion. They're selling because yields are 4.6%, while U.S. inflation is at 6.4%. They lose money holding American bonds. Where's that money going? To gold, yuan, BRICS bonds? Gold rose 44% since 2020. Central banks bought 1,184 metric tons of gold in 2023, the highest level since 1950. China owns 2,191 tons. Russia owns 2,298 tons. India bought 190 additional tons. But the real structural shift: BRICS is building alternative financial infrastructure. The BRICS New Development Bank issued $33 billion in loans since 2015, all in local currencies. The BRICS financial messaging system connects 159 banks in 12 countries, processing 34 million daily transactions without touching SWIFT. Brazil just announced it will issue 8.5 billion in sovereign bonds denominated in yuan. Those bonds offer yields of 5.7%, higher than U.S. Treasury bonds backed by Brazilian gold reserves. China committed to buying 6.2 billion. Saudi Arabia took 1.3 billion. Emirates bought 840 million. This isn't theoretical. It's capital moving out of the American system in documented real time. Mexico is considering an even bolder move. Sources at the Bank of Mexico tell me they're exploring resource-backed bonds, sovereign bonds guaranteed by proven reserves of silver, copper, and lithium. China would buy the entire issue. This transforms Mexican raw materials into currency without selling an ounce. Venezuela already did this. The petro, its oil-backed cryptocurrency, was ridiculed in Western media in 2018. Now it processes 2.1 billion in monthly transactions, mainly with Russia, China, and Iran. It demonstrates that sanctioned countries can create payment systems functioning outside American control. Each alternative subtracts dollar demand. Individually, they're minor changes. Collectively, they represent systemic collapse. Zoltan Pozsar, former Treasury official, wrote in August, "We're witnessing the birth of Bretton Woods III money, backed not by gold or faith, but by commodities and geopolitical power. This system won't be announced at a conference. It will simply replace the previous one through thousands of bilateral transactions until we wake up and the dollar is no longer the global reserve currency." That day is closer than Washington admits. When Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela finance infrastructure, trade energy, and settle debts without dollars, American exorbitant privilege ended. Now let me ask you, are you enjoying the analysis? If this geopolitical information helps you understand what's really happening in the world, hit subscribe. Join thousands who are waking up to realities that corporate media hide. If you find value here, give me a like. It really helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. Also, where are you watching this from? Leave me a comment with your city or country. I'm building a global community of people who reject packaged narratives, and I want to know where you are. Now let's return to the final analysis because this affects you directly. When I talk about the collapse of the petrodollar and treasury bonds, I'm not describing abstract problems for Washington. I'm describing why your cost of living is exploding and will worsen. You're 53 years old. You live in an American suburb. You watch your savings evaporate. In 2020, you had $89,000 in your 401k. Today, it's at $93,000. It looks like a 4.5% increase. But inflation was 24% in that period. In real purchasing power, you lost $17,000. It's not an accident. It's the result of dollars returning to the United States because other countries no longer need them for energy trade. Your groceries cost $165 weekly in 2020. Now they cost $213. That's $2,496 additional annually. Your electricity was $145 monthly. Now it's $198. That's $636 additional annually. Gasoline, $185 monthly in 2020, $295 now. That's $1,320 additional annually. Just those three items, food, energy, transportation, cost you $4,452 more annually than 4 years ago. Multiply by a family of 4. Multiply by 340 million Americans. We're talking about 1.5 trillion in purchasing power transferred from American consumers to energy corporations with record profits. But if you live in Sao Paulo earning 6,400 reais monthly, you experience the opposite side. In 2020, that equaled $1,180. Today, it equals $1,310. Your purchasing power in local currency increased because Brazil trades more in reais and yuan, strengthening your currency against the dollar. Your groceries cost 910 reais monthly in 2020. Today they cost 945 reais. Only 3.8% increase in 4 years, while Americans saw 29%. Why? Because Brazil buys wheat from Argentina in pesos, meat from Uruguay in reais, electronics from China in yuan. You don't pay the dollar premium on each transaction. A multipolar world is more stable than a unipolar one. When a single power dictates terms, everyone lives with uncertainty. When multiple powers compete, small countries gain leverage. Vietnam does this brilliantly. It trades with China in yuan, with the United States in dollars, with India in rupees. It takes loans from China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank at 2.9%. It takes American development subsidies for manufacturing. It buys Russian weapons. It partners with Japan on semiconductors. Vietnam grows 6.4% annually, playing all sides. That's what Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela are learning. And when they master it, Central America, the Caribbean, Colombia, Peru, Chile will follow. Because the model works. For you individually, this means diversify. If all your savings are in dollars, you're completely exposed to dollar inflation. Consider holding yuan, euros, gold, perhaps commodity-backed cryptocurrencies if you have risk tolerance. I'm not giving investment advice, I'm pointing out geopolitical reality. National currencies are less reliable. Asset-backed currencies are more reliable. Watch where capital flows. China builds 147 ports in 95 countries processing trade in yuan. Russia builds pipelines to India, Turkey, China, Pakistan, settling in local currencies. Saudi Arabia builds refineries in China, processing Saudi oil into refined products sold in Asia without touching Western markets. Physical infrastructure redraws financial maps. Once built, the change is permanent. Stay attentive. Stay informed. The next 18 months will determine if this transition is peaceful or violent. Washington still has military options. It can try to destabilize Latin American governments. It can activate covert operations, CIA-backed coups. But each option accelerates the trend Washington tries to reverse. Each coup pushes more countries toward China. Each sanction validates the need for dollar alternatives. Each military threat justifies defense partnerships with Russia. The United States is in a strategic trap of its own creation. The more it struggles, the tighter it becomes. The transition has already happened. The world simply hasn't realized it yet. It's not happening at superpower conferences. It's happening in executive decrees signed in Brasilia, Mexico City, Caracas, in oil tankers sailing to Shanghai instead of Houston, in bank transfers settling in yuan instead of dollars, in mining contracts transferred from American corporations to Chinese state enterprises. You are witnessing how the foundations of the world order are being reorganized before your eyes. Pay attention.